Leaves from a Russian Diary. Pitirim Sorokin. Part 4. 1921 to 1922. Chapter 23. New Butchery.
The dreadful days of revenge passed. The machine of the Red Terror still worked, but now it exterminated lives by tens and hundreds instead of by thousands and 10,000s. The new economic policy, forced on the communists, began to have a revivifying effect on the country. As in a fairy tale, the dead land seemed to come to life. The limits of our freedom were narrow, it is true, but individual initiative and responsibility did assert themselves. Shops and stalls, private offices and workshops, very poor and primitive at first, were opened. Wonderful it was to see exhibited in shop windows bread and meat, butter and vegetables. Just to enter without any permission, without any waiting in long queues, and to buy the little one could afford gave the most intense happiness. Those who have never known starvation, who have never experienced our fruitless wanderings from one communistic office to another, cannot even faintly imagine how happy we were now. Little by little Petrograd began to assume the outward aspect of a European city. People were repairing their houses, taking some care of their dress and appearance. The marks of death and desolation which had rested on us like a pall for 2 years, by September, 1922, had almost been obliterated. Luxurious hotels, restaurants with signs, everything as before, tram cars running, droshkis, theaters, and movies, decently dressed people, such was the outward appearance of the town. Inwardly the change had not been so great. Buildings left without any repairs were still in bad condition. The canals were foul, the water supply bad. Much poverty existed. But the busy streets, the shops and restaurants, and above all, the prosperous appearance of the communists and netmen, bourgeois of the new economic policy, gave the city a thriving appearance. These people showed an endless cupidity and desire for luxury, not for the people, of course, but for themselves. They displayed a fierce desire to make money, any way they could, by fraud, extortion, bribes, gambling, or theft. They seemed devoured by passion for luxuries, debauchery, mistresses, and their contempt for the welfare of the people was hardly concealed. These destroyers of capitalism were now ardent defenders of sacred private property, their own. By this utter selfishness, even more than by their former bloodthirstiness, they discredited in the eyes of the people socialism and communism. In the spiritual life of Russia a great revival awoke. While all other buildings were left to decay, the churches were repaired. Religious services, little attended between 1917 and 1920, now became crowded. On May 21, 1921, the communist demonstration was participated in by only a few thousands, but a religious procession, held on the following day, was attended by about 300,000 people. This procession was so big and so impressive that the communists themselves were obliged to take off their hats in respect. Those who did not remove their hats had them knocked off, and certain of the commissaries were attacked and beaten. Intellectuals and students, previously atheistical to a degree, now became religious. Professors Losky, Greves, Karsavin, and others, began to preach in the churches, a thing never heard of before. The traditional ideology of the Russian intelligentsia, materialistic, socialistic, and revolutionary, seemed to have been consumed in the conflagration of the revolution, and in its experimentum crucis, and a new and quite different ideology born. The anniversary of the university foundation was celebrated in a solemn and impressive meeting. About 5,000 professors and students, besides those of the institutes, were present at this meeting on February 3, 1922. After the rector Shimkovich delivered his address, I spoke. In my speech I pointed out the new guideposts which would be followed by the young generation. Old idols of socialism and communism, atheism and revolution, had fallen and should be forever abandoned. Old teachers of life, Marx, Engels, and others like them, had lost their authority and should forever be forgotten. They had led us to the edge of the abyss. Individual freedom, individual initiative and responsibility, cooperation, respect for liberty of others, reform instead of revolution, self-government instead of anarchy, these were now and should be our social ideals. Instead of the internationalism which had made our country the hunting ground of adventurers of all countries, the standard of nationalism, not inimical to other countries, but devoted to the welfare of our fatherland, is erected and will be upheld by the new generation. Next day the communist papers attacked me furiously, but the only result was that my speech was sent broadcast over the country calling forth many plaudits. Communist attacks had exactly that effect. Whatever their press condemned the people praised. Whatever it praised the people condemned. A free press even began to appear. At the end of 1921 a group of economists, sociologists, and historians started the publication of a scientific journal, The Economist. In spite of its high price, it sold readily. And the more the communist press assailed its articles, its editors, and contributors, the more popular it became. When Zinoviev and Lenin attacked me personally for my article, The Influence of War Upon Population, the journal was sold out in a week and a new edition had to be published. The communists could stop the growing popularity of The Economist only by suppressing it altogether and by banishment of its editors, and this would have been a little difficult, as no issue was published without preliminary permission of the censor. Some of the articles they suppressed, however, were in some mysterious way rewritten, copied, and circulated all over the country by the people. Scientific works and non-communist books and magazines were also circulated in the face of the censors. Communist censorship deserves a little description, since nothing like it ever existed under the Tsarist regime. A certain novel was suppressed because in it a red sister of mercy was described as smoking a cigarette while chatting with red soldiers. Said the censor.
A red sister of mercy, under our discipline, could not smoke or chatter. Change it into a white sister of mercy and the novel will be permitted.
An article by Professor Kaisvetter on late publications of Russian historians, absolutely academic in tone, was forbidden because
the author praises these books while our communistic historian, Professor Pokrovsky, disapproves them. Since Professor Pokrovsky places on them a low value, no favorable criticism can be allowed.
Nevertheless, the communistic straitjacket no longer held the people in confinement. They became courageous and openly satirized the ruling powers. The revolutionary title, Tovarishi, comrade, made obligatory, was now despised. If anybody was addressed as Tovarishi, the chances were that the reply would be, "Go to the devil." Many satiric poems and songs were circulated in manuscript. One of these poems, The Adventures of the Poor Fellow, Karl Marx, in communistic Russia, described how Marx had visited Russia, was arrested and condemned to death by the Cheka as a counter-revolutionary. How he stood in queues for food, wandered in commissariats, suffered in nationalized factories, was forbidden to teach or to publish his own views, was graphically described. Finally, in the poem, he burned his books, cursed socialism and communism and fled without his clothes. People even began to deface and destroy monuments which the communists had erected to their glory. In Odessa one morning the monument of Karl Marx, that is, the mouth and beard of the German prophet, were found plastered with millet gruel, and on the monument was written, "We have eaten plenty of it. Now eat it yourself." The population of Odessa had subsisted for more than a year on millet gruel, and the stuff at last became so disgusting to them that it could not be digested. In Petrograd one night the monument of Kogan Volodarsky, a communist leader killed in 1918, was blown to pieces and on his grave a dung heap was left, with a red flag on which were written these lines, after a poem of Pushkin.
I erected a monument not made with human hands, quite worthy of myself.
In 1922 communism in Russia was practically dead and the government was in a condition nearly of collapse. It was kept alive by terror, which was effective only because the people were physically exhausted, and it retained power only because of the terrible famine which had devastated Russia in 1921. This famine it was that gave the Soviet government courage again to drench the country with blood. Even while the famine threatened the terror began.
Comrades, the hydra of counter-revolution is raising its heads again. Either these heads must be cut off or we shall be devoured by the monster.
Thus spoke Zinoviev at a meeting of communist officials soon after the great religious demonstration of May 2, 1921.
We must demonstrate that the machine of the Red Terror still exists and works efficiently.
He concluded. Very soon after this, more than 100 people, mostly scholars, writers, and priests, were arrested. In their lodgings, as usual, were left Chekist guards who allowed no one to go out and who arrested everyone who for any reason entered. The morning after these arrests, Professor Tagintsev, 80 years old and the greatest criminologist in Russia, came to consult with friends about the arrest of his son, the geologist Tagintsev. We met in the apartment of Professor N. Lazarevsky, leading authority in constitutional law. In the lodgings of the arrested Tagintsev, after he and his wife had been taken away, were left only 2 children, whom the Chekist guards, of course, felt under no obligation to feed. If we did not send food to the children, they would starve. If we did send it, it would mean the arrest of the person who went. Too well we knew the practice of the Cheka, to catch the enemies of the people, by holding their children foodless in hopes that sooner or later someone would come to their rescue. Finally, old Professor Tagintsev determined himself to go. He went and was arrested. Unfortunately, that day we were unable to get very much food, and after a few days another one of us had to volunteer to go with supplies and be arrested.
I suppose I shall be arrested also,
said Lazarevsky.
Because Tagantsev's son and I have been friends from boyhood, and in his lodgings must be many of my letters.
I begged him to disappear, but he said that as vice president of the university he felt he could not afford just then to leave.
Let us wait and see what happens,
he said. Some weeks passed. More people were arrested and a few were released. Among these were the venerable Professor Tagintsev and his grandchildren. In July, Lazarevsky received a summons from the Cheka to appear before it as a witness in the affair of the younger Tagintsev. In spite of the advice of his friends, he went, and was detained, only as a witness and for a few days, as the Chekists explained to his wife. Lazarevsky himself wrote to her.
Don't be alarmed. I am in no danger, and in a few days I hope to be free.
At the beginning of August, however, Pravda published an article about a new Tagintsev plot, just uncovered by the authorities. The tone of this article convinced us that all the arrested persons were in great danger, and every one of us, professors and writers, friends and relatives of the prisoners, began work in their behalf. The elder Tagintsev went to Moscow to see Lenin, to beg him to forbid the threatened butchery. But he was not allowed to see Lenin. Then he wrote a letter to the dictator, reminding him that years ago he had risked his position of senator and judge of the Supreme Court, in an effort to save the brother of Lenin from execution, and how, failing in this, he had illegally arranged a last meeting between the condemned man and his mother.
In memory of this service, which you well remember, and in memory of your brother, as a father and a man, I beseech you to prevent this butchery of my son and his wife, and of other innocent people.
Thus wrote the great criminologist. The letter was given to Lenin, but no reply was sent. Lenin and his companions needed a new reign of terror to frighten the people, who were becoming overbold. Relatives of the arrested ceased altogether to hear of or from them.
This silence alarms me greatly,
Mrs. Lazarevsky told us.
I fear something terrible may happen to my husband.
We feared also, but in spite of vague rumors nothing was really known of the intention of the government. On the morning of August 23 I called on Mrs. Lazarevsky to console her and to hear if she had received any news. While we were talking, the postman came in and handed her a bundle of letters.
5 letters at once from my husband.
She exclaimed with beaming face.
What happiness!
Reading them she told me.
All goes well. He tells me not to be anxious, the affair is approaching an end, and he will soon be home.
I do not know why I was so disturbed by those letters, but after congratulating her I went out. The house of the scholars was very near the Lazarevsky home, and on the house next to it I perceived a freshly glued copy of Pravda. Strangely alarmed, I stopped and read it.
The Tagantsev plot and its suppression
Was the heading of the article which met my eyes.
By order of the Petrograd Soviet, the following persons were executed yesterday for participation in a counter-revolutionary plot.
Horrified, my eyes ran along the list of names badly printed on dirty gray paper.
Tagantsev, professor, for organization of the plot. Mrs. Tagantsev, his wife, for participation and for failing to denounce her husband. Lazarevsky, professor, prorector of Petrograd University, for composition of a project of a new electoral law. Tikvinsky, professor, for writing a report adversely describing the present state of the Soviet oil industry. Gumilev, writer and poet, for his monarchist opinions. Akhtomsky, painter and scholar, for giving information about the museums. Gisity and wife.
And so on, more than 50 names, each with a short account of their crimes. Some of these offenses were merely described as counter-revolutionary. At the end was printed,
And other counter-revolutionaries.
5 letters at once from my husband, he will soon be home.
These words of Mrs. Lazarevsky burned in my brain. Now I knew why I had been so disturbed. To keep those letters for many days and send them to a wife after her husband had been shot. What a hellish deed.
Hush! Don't express your opinions so loudly,
said an acquaintance who passed at the moment. I had not known that I was speaking aloud. My first thought was to go back to Mrs. Lazarevsky, but I literally could not do it. Let someone else tell her of her happiness. Shot for adversely describing the state of the Soviet oil industry. The oil industry was indeed in a deplorable state, but the report of Tikvinsky was written for the Soviet by order of Lenin himself. Shot for giving information about the museums. Shot for writing a project for a new electoral law. I remembered our private discussions during the Kronstadt riots, about the reorganization of the government, the courts, and the police, should the Soviet government fall. Lazarevsky said then that he would try to outline a new electoral law. This outline, falling in the hands of the Bolsheviki, had condemned him. Shot for his monarchist opinions. Not the fact that Gumilev was one of the greatest poets in Russia, not his bravery in the war, which had been rewarded by the Order of St. George, not the discretion of his daily conduct were enough to save him. He had monarchist convictions. In this plot were involved people who had never even known each other, and all of them had been denied even an open trial. If in a bourgeois country such a mockery of justice had been accorded communists or anarchists, what a roar would have been heard all over the world against the merciless cruelty of capitalism. But this was not the full extent of communist cruelty. When Mrs. Lazarevsky and relatives of the other victims of the bloodthirsty god requested the Cheka to give them the bodies of their beloved for burial, the Cheka insolently answered,
What bodies? Those persons have been sent to Archangel prison.
Most of the relatives knew this was intended as an added torture, but two, not really believing, and hoping that their people were still alive, became insane. Visiting old Professor Tagantsev, I found the aged man utterly crushed with grief.
It is time for me to die,
he said weeping.
All is over for me. But my grandchildren, they have sent them to an asylum for young criminals. Why could they not permit those innocents to be brought up by our friends? I thought once that they were human, but now I know that they are worse than devils.
In 1922, soon after my own banishment, poor old Tagantsev died.
This proletarian justice once more shows our enemies our power.
Grishka III declared in a speech.
Let them remember this lesson.
We remember. If ever we are given opportunity to do justice to him and his companions, may God help us not to be too soft-hearted.